Have you ever wondered where the story you were taught in school actually came from? Welcome back to Echoes of Forgotten Lives, my friend. I'm so glad you're joining me today. Take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let this story begin. Now imagine for a moment you are holding an old, worn schoolbook, the kind millions of children once studied from, year after year, its pages soft at the corners, from decades of careful, trusting hands. Somewhere inside its pages, a single sentence claims that one brave sailor discovered an entire continent in the year 1492. Millions of people, across many generations, simply repeated this sentence, the same way you might repeat a familiar date or a familiar name, without ever questioning it too closely. But what was truly waiting on that distant shore, long before that sailor ever arrived, would change everything you thought you knew. Long before any European ship ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean, the land we now call America was already alive, with thousands of years of rich, complex human history. Hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, its own government, and its own deep, careful understanding of the land itself, stretched across the entire continent, from the frozen north to the warm southern coasts. Cities rose and fell long before Europe's own great cathedrals were ever built. Trade routes connected communities separated by thousands of miles, carrying shells, copper, and carefully worked stone tools across the continent's own vast interior. Complex societies built earthen mounds, some rivaling the size of ancient pyramids, along the rivers of what is now the American Midwest, forming cities that once housed tens of thousands of people, larger, at their peak, than London itself was at the very same time. This was not an empty wilderness, quietly waiting to be found. It was already home to millions of people who had lived, farmed, traded, and built there for countless generations. Near the Mississippi River, one such city, known today as Cahokia, grew into a genuine metropolis, a large, densely populated urban center, home to as many as 20,000 people at its own peak around the year 1100 AD. Centuries before 1492, another set of ships had already touched these distant shores. Norse sailors, traveling from Greenland in sturdy wooden longships, reached the northeastern coast of North America sometime around the year 1000 AD. Archaeologists have since confirmed a genuine Norse settlement at a place now called Meadows in present-day Newfoundland, complete with the remains of turf houses, low, sturdy homes built from thick layers of packed earth and grass, and iron tools, the kind no indigenous culture in that particular region had yet developed on their own. These early Norse settlers called this new land Vinland, though their own small settlement did not survive for very long, likely abandoned after a few short years due to conflict with the region's existing inhabitants and the sheer difficulty of maintaining supply lines across such a vast, unforgiving ocean. Still, the evidence remains, quietly buried in the soil, proof that European feet had already touched this continent, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail. There is a famous story you may have heard, my friend, repeated in countless classrooms, across countless generations, printed confidently in textbook after textbook. It claims that Christopher Columbus discovered America, sailing boldly across an unknown ocean in the year 1492, planting a flag on soil no outsider had ever seen before. But here is the truth, carefully documented by historians today. Columbus never actually set foot on the mainland of North America, not once, in his entire life. He landed instead on islands in the Caribbean Sea, believing, right up until his own death, that he had simply found a new route to Asia, and calling the people he met there Indians, a mistaken label that would echo, confusingly, for centuries afterward. He never knew the true scale of what he had actually encountered, and he was certainly not the first outsider to arrive, since Norse sailors had already quietly done so, nearly 500 years earlier, and millions of indigenous people had already called this land home, for thousands of years before that. The popular story of discovery, repeated so often and so confidently, quietly hides a far more complicated and far more honest truth. Still, Columbus's voyages did open a genuine, lasting wave of European exploration, and eventually, settlement. Spanish explorers pushed into the southern regions of the continent, establishing the city of St. Augustine, in present-day Florida, in 1565, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in what would later become the United States. French traders moved along its rivers and northern coastlines, building relationships and trading partnerships with numerous indigenous nations along the way. English colonists, arriving later, established a fragile settlement at Jamestown in the year 1607, followed soon afterward by another small group seeking religious freedom, who landed further north in the year 1620 at a place they named Plymouth. These early colonies struggled desperately through disease, hunger, and genuine uncertainty, their survival often depending directly on the knowledge and the goodwill of the very indigenous nations whose land they had settled upon, nations who taught them which crops would actually grow in this unfamiliar soil. In that same period, in the year 1619, another ship arrived, carrying a very different, far more painful cargo. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the colony of Virginia, marking the beginning of a system of slavery that would eventually stretch across more than 2 centuries, shaping the economy and the deep, lasting wounds of the growing colonies. This difficult thread, woven permanently into the fabric of the emerging nation, cannot be honestly separated from any complete telling of America's own history, no matter how uncomfortable that thread may be to fully examine, or how often it has been quietly left out of simpler, more comfortable versions of the story. Over the following century, 13 separate British colonies grew steadily along the eastern coastline, each developing its own distinct character, its own local government, and its own economy, some built around tobacco and cotton, others around shipping, fishing, and small craft industry. But growing tension, over taxation, and over genuine representation in decisions made far away, across the ocean, slowly built toward open conflict, as colonists increasingly resented paying taxes to a government in which they had no direct voice. By the year 1775, fighting had broken out between colonial militias and British soldiers near the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The following year, in 1776, representatives from all 13 colonies formally declared their independence in a carefully written document that still shapes how many people understand freedom itself, even today. The war that followed lasted 8 long years, testing the endurance and the genuine resolve of a newly forming nation, fought across forests, rivers, and coastal towns, often with soldiers poorly equipped and rarely paid on time. When it finally ended, in 1783, the 13 former colonies stood as an independent country, though a genuinely fragile one, still working out exactly how such a large, diverse territory could actually be governed together, without simply recreating the same kind of distant, unaccountable power they had just fought so hard to escape. In 1787, delegates gathered once again in the city of Philadelphia, this time to write a formal constitution, establishing the structure of government that, with amendments, still guides the country today. The document they produced was itself a genuine compromise, balancing the competing interests of large states and small ones, of northern and southern economies, and of citizens who held deeply differing visions for exactly what this new experiment in self-government should ultimately become. Even its own authors, debating late into humid Philadelphia summer nights, could not have fully predicted the nation their careful words would eventually help create. The centuries that followed brought westward expansion, often at devastating cost to the indigenous nations who had lived there for millennia, pushed steadily from their own ancestral homelands through broken treaties and forced relocation. They brought a brutal civil war, fought between 1861 and 1865, partly over the very institution of slavery, first introduced in 1619, a war that claimed more American lives than any conflict before or since. They brought waves of immigrants, arriving from every corner of the globe, through ports like Ellis Island in New York, each one adding their own language, their own food, and their own story to an already complicated national identity. America's history was never a single, simple story of discovery. It was, and remains, a layered, sometimes painful, sometimes remarkable braid of many different peoples, arriving by many different paths, at many different times. And here is what stays with me most, my friend, thinking about this story today. The real history of any place is rarely as simple as the version first written down in a schoolbook. It is built, quietly, from countless overlapping stories, some remembered proudly, others too long forgotten or too long ignored, layered on top of one another, like sediment settling slowly at the bottom of a river. History is not a single voice speaking clearly from the past. It is a chorus, and the truest version of any story is the one that finally lets every voice in that chorus be heard. Learning any new language means something similar. The version of a story you first hear is rarely the whole truth. Real understanding comes only when you keep listening, keep asking, and keep making room for the fuller, more complicated picture underneath. That patient willingness to look closer, to trade a simple story for a truer one, is itself a quiet form of courage. So keep going, my friend. Keep listening. Keep learning. One honest layer at a time. Every place and every person carries a fuller story, waiting patiently underneath the version most people simply repeat. If this story stayed with you today, you are certainly not alone. The real history behind familiar places remains one of the most quietly fascinating things we can ever choose to explore. precisely because the familiar version so rarely tells the whole story. There are so many more forgotten lives and forgotten stories, waiting patiently for us to uncover them together, one at a time. Each one carries a quiet lesson, wrapped gently inside an unforgettable moment. I would truly love for you to be here when we open the next one together. If you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss it. Subscribing costs you nothing at all, but it means we get to keep exploring these lost corners of history, side by side, story after story, one honest layer at a time. Somewhere out there, right now, is another story history has almost completely forgotten, and soon, my friend, we will bring it gently back into the light, together. Tell me, in the comments below, which version of history did you grow up believing that you have since learned was more complicated and more interesting than the simple version you were first told? Until next time, take care of yourself and never stop learning, one honest, patient layer at a time.